The moment I heard those words, something cold moved through me. Not fear exactly, but the kind of stillness that comes right before everything changes. My name is Edmund. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a high school history teacher in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and for most of those years, I believed that if you raised your children with honesty and love, they would carry that forward. I believed it the way you believe in gravity. Not because you've tested it, but because the alternative is too unsettling to consider. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday in March. My daughter called me while I was grading papers, or what used to be papers, back when I still tutored part-time to keep my mind busy after retirement. She said she had a surprise for me. Her voice had that brightness in it, the kind she used when she was excited, and for a moment I was just her father again, listening to his little girl. "Dad," she said, "you've been working too hard. You need to rest. Really rest." I laughed. I'm 67. What does rest even look like? "That's exactly what I want to show you," she said. "I booked you a trip, a river cruise, the Mississippi, 10 days, your own cabin, all meals included, live music every evening. You always said you wanted to do something like that." I had said that. Years ago, when her mother was still alive, we talked about doing a river cruise someday. We never got around to it. After Margaret passed, 4 years ago now, pancreatic cancer, very fast. I'd stopped thinking about it. The trip belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed. But standing there in my kitchen, holding the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, something like anticipation. "That's very generous of you," I said. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," she said. "You're my dad. You deserve it." I should have noticed that she didn't answer the question. I should have noticed a lot of things. She sent a booking confirmation to my email that same night. The cruise departed from St. Louis on April 4th. Cabin 114, the Mississippi Queen, a restored paddle wheel riverboat that ran from St. Louis to New Orleans over 10 days, stopping at Memphis, Natchez, Baton Rouge. The ticket was beautiful. Everything looked first class. I printed it out and put it on the refrigerator the way Margaret used to do with things she was looking forward to. I stood there looking at it for a while. I called my son-in-law the next day just to thank him, assuming he'd been part of the plan. He said, "Oh yeah, absolutely, we thought you'd enjoy it." He sounded distracted. He's always distracted. I didn't read anything into it. 2 weeks before the trip, I was cleaning out my email and I noticed something. The confirmation had come as a forwarded message, not sent directly from the cruise line, but forwarded from my daughter's account. A small thing. I almost didn't open it again, but I did. And there, in the original email chain below the booking confirmation, was a message she hadn't meant to include. Or maybe she'd forgotten it was there. It was between her and her husband, and it was short, just a few lines. "The one-way looks fine. He won't know until he's already on board. By the time it matters, everything will already be done." I read it 3 times. One way. I went to the cruise line's website and typed in my confirmation number. The cabin was booked. 10 days, St. Louis to New Orleans. But when I looked at the return section, it was blank. There was no return fare, no connecting flight home. The booking ended in New Orleans. I sat down at my kitchen table and stayed there for a long time. I want to tell you I immediately knew what it meant. I want to say I was sharp and calm. But the truth is, my first thought was that it was a mistake, a clerical error. Maybe they'd forgotten to add the return leg. Maybe my daughter had meant to book round trip and something had gone wrong. So I called her. "Hey, Dad," she said, "getting excited about the trip?" "I wanted to ask about the return," I said. "The booking shows one way. How am I getting home from New Orleans?" A pause, just a half second, but I'd taught teenagers for 32 years. I knew what a pause that length meant. "Oh, I was going to surprise you," she said. "We figured you could spend a few extra days in New Orleans afterward. You always wanted to see it properly. There's a flight back. I just haven't sent it yet. Can you send it now? Dad, I'm at work. I'll send it tonight. She didn't send it that night, or the next night. Every time I asked, there was a reason. Work was busy. The kids were sick. She'd get to it tomorrow. I started sleeping badly. I have a friend from my teaching days. A retired detective named Lou used to do work for the school district. He came over on a Saturday and I showed him the email. He read it without expression, then looked up at me. "Edmund," he said quietly, "do you have a will?" I did. I'd updated it 2 years after Margaret died. My estate, the house, my pension, Margaret's life insurance, a modest investment account would go to my daughter, with a small portion set aside for my grandchildren's college funds. At the time, it had seemed like the right thing to do. "Have you talked to your attorney recently?" Lou asked. "I hadn't, not in over a year." "Call him Monday," Lou said, "and don't tell your daughter you're going." I asked him what he thought was happening. He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should get on that boat, and I think you should pay very close attention to everything." "You think someone on the boat?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but that email didn't write itself, and everything will already be done. That's not a travel agent talking." I lay awake that entire night. I thought about my daughter as a little girl, the way she used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. I thought about how she'd cried at Margaret's funeral, genuinely cried, and I'd held her. I thought about the past 2 years, how she'd started asking more questions about the house, whether I'd considered downsizing, whether I'd thought about what happens if something happens to me. I had thought it was concern, a daughter worried about her aging father. Maybe it was something else entirely. I called my attorney Monday morning. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't know how to say it out loud yet. I just asked him to review my will and send me a current copy. He said he'd have it to me by the end of the week. I also called Lou back and asked him to do some quiet checking. He said he would. Then, on a gray Thursday morning, I drove to the bank. I withdrew a specific amount of cash, enough for emergencies, enough to be untraceable, and I opened a second account at a different branch, a small credit union across town, in my name only. I moved a portion of my funds there, not everything, just enough to matter. I didn't tell anyone. And then I went home and I packed my bag for the cruise. Because Lou was right. I needed to get on that boat. The Mississippi Queen was exactly what the brochure had promised. Beautiful, in that old-fashioned American way that feels like a movie set come to life. Gleaming white with red trim, the paddle wheel turning slowly at the stern, the whole thing gliding out onto the river like it owned the water. Under different circumstances, I might have been genuinely moved by it. I found my cabin, unpacked slowly, sat on the narrow bed and looked out the porthole at the brown Missouri shoreline slipping past. I had my phone, my attorney's number, Lou's number, a small notebook. Lou had said to write down everything I noticed. Everything. Dinner the first night was in the main dining room. Long communal tables, the kind meant to encourage strangers to become friendly. I sat down across from an older man traveling alone. He introduced himself as Oliver, 64 years old, retired civil engineer from Nashville. His wife had passed 2 years earlier. He said it the same way I always say it about Margaret, like it's a fact that still surprises him sometimes. We talked easily. He'd been on 3 river cruises before. He knew which deck had the best view in the mornings, which excursion stops were worth getting off for, and which were tourist traps. He had a quiet, precise way of speaking. A man who'd spent a career measuring things, making sure they were correct. I liked him immediately, and I told myself to be careful about that. Lou had said to trust no one on that boat. I'd nodded when he said it. But Oliver had this quality, I noticed it over the first 2 days, of listening when you spoke. Not waiting for his turn to speak, actually listening. It's rarer than it should be. By the second evening, sitting on the upper deck while Memphis lit up the bank ahead of us, I'd told him more than I intended. Not everything, but enough that he looked at me for a long moment after I finished and said, "You think someone on this boat is supposed to make sure you don't finish the trip." I hadn't said that directly, but that's what I'd been thinking. "I don't know," I said. "Have you noticed anyone watching you?" I had, actually. A younger man, mid-30s, traveling alone, always seemed to be one table away at meals, always seemed to be on the same deck. He'd tried to strike up a conversation the first morning, and I'd been polite but brief. He'd backed off. But I kept seeing him. Oliver said, "What did your friend the detective say to do if you felt threatened?" "Call him, and call the ship's security." "Then that's what you do." He said it simply, the way you'd say then. That's the exit. No drama, just the logical next step. There was something steadying about it. I called Lou that night from my cabin. I described the younger man. Lou said to keep watching, don't engage, don't let on, that I'd noticed anything. He'd been doing his own checking back home. He paused before he told me what he'd found. "Edmund," he said, "your daughter and her husband met with an estate attorney 6 weeks ago. They also consulted a financial advisor about, and I'm quoting here, accelerating an inheritance timeline." The room felt very small. "Lou?" "I know," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after he stopped talking, just listening to the river sounds outside the porthole. The water moving past the hull, old, slow, indifferent water that had been there long before any of us and would be there long after. I asked Lou what I should do. "Document everything. And Edmund, change your will. Call your attorney tomorrow and change it." I called my attorney the next morning from a quiet corner of the observation deck. He was surprised to hear from me. I'd spoken to him just a week before. I told him I needed changes made immediately, and I told him what I wanted. He asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. He said he'd draw up the new documents and I could review them when I returned. When I returned. I was going to return. I had decided that. Oliver found me on the deck afterward. He could tell something had shifted. I don't know how. Maybe he just had that kind of attentiveness. He brought me a cup of coffee without asking, and sat down and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Is there something I can help with?" I looked at him, 64 years old, retired engineer, widower, a man with no obvious reason to be kind to me beyond the fact that we'd both happened to sit at the same table 3 nights ago. And I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The younger man you mentioned, I've noticed him too. He doesn't read at meals. He eats facing outward, watching the room. That's not what a tourist does." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." "What do you mean?" he asked. I thought about it. "A witness," I said. "Someone who can say what they saw if it comes to that." Oliver nodded once. "Then I'm here." Over the next 3 days, we moved carefully. Oliver started tracking the younger man's patterns while I acted as normally as I could manage. Meals, excursions, evening music. I went to the jazz performance in Natchez with a group of retired couples and danced badly and laughed and took photographs, and all the while I was aware of exactly where that young man was standing. On the 7th night, we were south of Baton Rouge, the lights of the refineries flickering on the dark water. I was walking back to my cabin when I heard footsteps behind me on the narrow corridor. I didn't turn. I kept walking. The footsteps stayed the same distance behind me. I turned the corner and pressed myself against the wall and waited. When the young man came around, he nearly walked into me. He stopped. His face did something complicated. "Evening," I said pleasantly. He said evening back. His voice was very controlled. I wanted to let you know, I said, just as pleasantly, that I've been documenting your movement since St. Louis. I have photographs. I've shared them with a retired detective in Harrisburg and with the ship's security officer. I hadn't gone to ship security yet, but I decided I would in the morning. I also spoke with my attorney 3 days ago and made changes to my estate documents that your employers may not be aware of. He didn't say anything. His jaw worked. I don't know who hired you, I said, though I have a strong suspicion. What I do know is that there's nothing left for you to accomplish here, so I'd suggest you enjoy the rest of the cruise. I walked past him. My hands were shaking inside my jacket pockets, but my voice had stayed even. I was proud of that, in a way Margaret would have recognized. I went directly to Oliver's cabin and knocked. He opened the door in his bathrobe, looking alarmed. I told him what I'd done. He stared at me for a moment and then started laughing, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "Edmund," he said, "you're something else." I went to the ship's security officer first thing the next morning. I brought my notebook with dates, times, and descriptions. I brought the photographs I'd taken on my phone. I told the security officer, a tall, serious woman named Chief Hartley, exactly what I suspected and why. She listened with the careful attention of someone who takes their job seriously and asked me to stay available for the rest of the day. By mid-afternoon, she found me in the dining room. The young man had been interviewed. He provided identification and a story that didn't entirely hold together. He was not removed from the ship. She didn't have legal grounds for that, but he was moved to a different deck and informed that he was being monitored. More importantly, Chief Hartley had made a note of everything and offered to provide a written account if I needed it for legal purposes. I said I thought I might. I called Lou from New Orleans, standing on the levee with the river behind me and the French Quarter a few blocks away. He'd already been busy. He'd spoken to a colleague with the Dauphin County District Attorney's Office. There were questions now about what had been planned and who had planned it. My daughter had received a phone call, not from law enforcement yet, but from Lou directly. He'd asked her some questions in that calm, methodical way of his. She'd called me that evening. I was having dinner with Oliver at a small Creole restaurant on Frenchman Street. Red beans, catfish, a cold beer, the sound of a brass band drifting in from outside. I answered. "Tad," she said. Her voice was very different now, not bright. "Something else. Dad, we need to talk." "Yes," I said, "we do." I let the silence sit. "I don't know what you think you know," she said. "I know enough," I said, "and so does my attorney, and so does Lou, and so does a security officer on a cruise ship who has a written record of events." She started to say something. I interrupted her gently. "I love you," I said. "I want you to know that. Whatever you thought you needed to do, whatever your husband convinced you of, I want you to know that hasn't changed. But I'm not going to pretend that nothing happened, and I'm not going to make decisions about my estate under pressure or fear. I'm going to live my life, my actual life, and what happens next is going to be decided by the courts and by God, and not by you." She was crying. I could hear it. I waited until it subsided. "Are you safe?" I asked. "Are the grandchildren safe?" "Yes," she said. "Good," I said. "Then that's where we start." I hung up and set the phone face down on the table. Oliver looked at me from across the plates of half-eaten catfish. "Okay," he said. "I will be," I said. He nodded and signaled the waiter for another round. Outside, the brass band shifted into something slower, a song I half remembered from years ago that I couldn't quite name. The night air was warm and thick with river smell, and somewhere close by, a woman was laughing at something her companion had said. I picked up my fork and finished my dinner. The legal process moved slowly, the way these things do. My son-in-law, it turned out, had been the primary architect of the plan. The estate attorney visits, the financial consultations, the arrangements made on that boat. My daughter had known more than she admitted and less than he had. Whether that distinction matters is something the courts are still working through. I don't know what I want the outcome to be. Some mornings I think I know, other mornings I don't. What I do know is this: I changed my will. My grandchildren's college funds are intact and protected. The house is still mine. My pension is still mine. I am still here. I see Oliver every few months. He drove up from Nashville in October, and we spend a weekend going to the Gettysburg battlefield. A retired history teacher and a retired civil engineer arguing about troop movements and supply lines and decision-making under pressure. It was one of the best weekends I've had in years. He'd lost his wife. I'd lost mine. We'd both been alone in ways that people who haven't experienced it don't quite understand. And then, on a paddle wheel riverboat on the Mississippi, in a year neither of us expected much from, we found something worth keeping. Not every story about a parent and a child ends cleanly. Mine hasn't ended yet, not that part of it. Some wounds take a long time to scar over, and some questions about what you meant to someone, what you were worth to them, don't have answers you can live with easily. But I wake up in the morning in my own house. I drink my coffee at the kitchen table where Margaret used to leave notes for me. I grade papers for the tutoring students I've taken back on, because it turns out I'm not built for doing nothing. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, I call Oliver and we talk about everything and nothing, the way old friends do. I spent 32 years teaching young people that history is not just what happened, it's what you chose to do when you understood what was at stake. I think I finally understand what I was teaching. There's a moment I keep coming back to, sitting at that table in New Orleans, catfish going cold in front of me, my daughter's voice breaking on the other end of the phone. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something much quieter and harder to name, like when a bone sets wrong and the doctor has to re-break it before it can heal correctly. Necessary. But it still hurts. I've thought a lot about what made the difference, not the legal steps, not the second bank account, not even Lou's detective work, though all of that mattered. What made the difference was something I'd spent 32 years trying to teach teenagers and had apparently needed to relearn myself, that paying attention is an act of courage, that choosing to see clearly, even when what you're seeing breaks your heart, is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength there is. My son-in-law counted on me being a trusting old man. He was not entirely wrong. I had been trusting. But he made the mistake of assuming that trust and blindness are the same thing. They are not. I trusted my daughter because I loved her. That love didn't disappear when I found the email, but it did change shape. It became something with edges. Oliver, in his quiet engineer's way, understood something about me before I understood it myself. He saw that I was not a man who needed to be rescued. I was a man who needed a witness, someone to confirm that what I was seeing was real and that acting on it was right. That's what he gave me. And I think about what his presence on that boat cost him, his time, his comfort, the risk of getting involved in something that had nothing to do with him, and I'm still moved by it. A stranger's decency in a moment when a family member's had failed. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of thing you carry. The cause and effect of those 10 days is not complicated when I look at it straight. My son-in-law believed that greed was a plan, that if you wanted something badly enough and arranged the circumstances carefully enough, you could simply take it. What he didn't account for is that people, even old, retired, supposedly soft people, still think, still notice, still act. Greed assumes passivity in its target. It is always, eventually, wrong about that. I didn't handle that cruise perfectly. I was frightened more often than I let on. There were nights when I second-guessed myself, when the loneliness of the situation pressed in, and I wondered if I was reading too much into things. But I kept moving. I kept writing things down. I kept making the next right choice, even when I wasn't sure it was right. That's the only thing I know how to call courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep functioning inside it. What I want anyone to take from this, if they're sitting somewhere right now recognizing pieces of their own story in mine, is this: your age is not your vulnerability. Your love for your family is not your weakness. The moment you decide to see clearly and act on what you see, the terms of the situation change entirely. Edmund, the retired history teacher, didn't fight back because he was exceptional. He fought back because he paid attention. That's available to all of us.